On behalf of the Institute for Human Ecology, welcome to the Catholic University of America. The Institute for Human Ecology exists to educate university students to give the Republic her best citizens, to sponsor multidisciplinary academic research on the intersection of human flourishing and Catholic social doctrine, and to organize events encouraging conversation between the academy and the public square. The topic of discussion today is federal control of land policy, especially as it relates to certain Western lands. At the heart of it, this is a moral issue. When it comes to land policy, a person's participation in forming the policies of his neighborhood, town, county, and state are crucial. The conversations and decision-making through which people shape their community, deciding on zoning, the building of roads, and the funding of schools, parks, and hospitals, produces two general goods: the decision made and the personal bonds may be made among the citizenry in arriving at those decisions. That process helps form a peaceful and cohesive society. But among the various states, we have a stark disparity as to the amount of land owned on one hand by the federal government, and on the other hand by state government and private persons. In the East, the federal government owns relatively little land. In the West, it owns very little land in some states, but huge amounts of land in others. The greater that ownership, the less people are able to shape their communities. We're honored to have Ken Ivory here to discuss how this came to be, the implications, and some possible solutions. Ken is an attorney and served for 9 years in the Utah House of Representatives. He is an adjunct professor at Utah Valley University, where he teaches American federalism. In 2014, the American Legislative Exchange Council named Ken the National State Legislator of the Year, and he currently chairs its National Center to Restore the Balance of Government. He is the author of Where's the Line? How States Protect the Constitution. Ken and his wife, Becky, are the proud parents of 4 children and the grandparents of 2 babies. Ken, welcome to the Catholic University of America.
Thanks, Emmett. It's always a pleasure to be with you. Yeah, that's a wonderful, wonderful topic, big topic to dive into.
It is. It's a great topic. It's very interesting, and it's one. Speaking as an Easterner, it's one that few people in the East are really aware of. And I had no idea of the magnitude of it until I saw one of your presentations. I think we really have what can best be described as an oddity in the relationship between the federal government and the states. In 11 Western states, the federal government owns 45% of the land. In the rest of the country, it owns about 4%, and even less if you exclude Alaska. I'm wondering if you could give us some background on how this came to be.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned this is a moral issue. It's an environmental issue. It's an economic issue. It's a constitutional issue. Of the 640 million acres that the federal government owns, 90% of that is west of the Rocky Mountains. In Utah, for example, 90% of the people live on 1% of the land. We're one of the most urbanized states in the nation. And you wouldn't think that, right? You think that the vast stretches of land out west. But there's some really exciting opportunities in all of this. If I could, I'm going to pull up a PowerPoint that if that's come up. We're at a place now, Emmett. The Western land discussion has taken us across the spectrum. We've had great battles and discussions and looked at legislation. We're now at a place coming out of Utah where we're at a unanimous bipartisan place in how to approach Western lands issues. And you mentioned the the situation with the map. Let me see if I can get this to advance forward. This is what we're talking about that you mentioned. The red is the federally owned land, and you just see a stark difference from the east to the west. And in Nevada, 85% of the land is federally controlled. In Utah, it's about 63%. Similarly to Alaska, that's just an enormous amount of acreage. And some of the challenges that come from that in Utah specifically, we're last in the nation in per pupil funding, and we have been for decades. We vie with Idaho and other Western states on who's last and who's having the greatest challenge funding education, because in government funding, you have income tax, you have sales tax, and property tax. And in Utah, we have 21% of the land is taxable, and that just challenges communities. This is what really got me looking at this issue back in 2011, that we're $2.2 billion below average in per pupil funding in 2011. And that's because we have 21% taxable land. Utah generates more property tax in 6 days on the land that's taxable than we receive all year in any property tax replacement payments from the federal government. There's a substitute, a property tax substitute that the federal government instituted in 1976 called payment in lieu of taxes. And it was supposed to be a tax equivalent substitute. And that's where this opportunity is coming in now. We had this payment in lieu of taxes. It's not stable. It's controlled as kind of a political football. It's adjusted from year to year. And instead of being a property tax substitute, Congress uses it kind of as political leverage to work on Western communities. In 2014, the federal government wanted to increase the budget by $1 trillion. And so they held hostage this $400 million of payment in lieu of taxes to Western states to get them to vote along with this increase in federal funding. So even though this is a critical issue in the West, and it is, folks in the East, you're paying the price for states in the West being completely dependent on federal subsidies and these payment in lieu of taxes and the control of the land, because politically the Western states have to go along with the policies and the things that happen in Washington, because it's a matter of sheer survival. And so the political opportunity that's come about now, I was sitting next to someone politically polar opposite of me, and Jim DeBacchus, and I said, Jim, as long as the federal government controls the land, don't you think they should treat our kids and our communities fairly? And he looked at me and he said, I know, right? And I wondered if he was serious. I said, are you serious? He's like, no, I'm completely serious. And so in 2018, we worked on legislation together that was unanimously co-sponsored by every member of the House, passed the House and Senate unanimously, to determine the fair taxable value of the federal lands to deal with this promise that the federal government made when they said, in 1976, they said, we're going to not dispose of the lands like they did for all the states east of the Rockies, but they recognized that shift in policy would take the land off the tax rolls. And so the Congressional Research Service says, because of that shift, Congress agreed with the recommendations of the Public Land Law Review Commission that they've got to pay compensation to these communities to make up for the presence of non-taxable land. And they said that they're going to stabilize these payments, and it's going to be on a tax equivalent basis. And the GAO says that they'll be just as if the lands were privately owned. And the Department of Energy, it'll be just as if the land had remained on the tax rolls. Well, it hasn't worked out that way. They pay about $1 an acre for the lands in the West. And I know, Emmett, you probably would be happy to pay $1 an acre in property tax, and any of the folks in the East would be happy to pay $1 an acre in the property tax. But we have a landowner that controls 63% of the land that's paying roughly $1 an acre in property tax replacement in the West.
And it's interesting too, I'm struck by the fact that Texas, for example, has very low federal ownership. It's about 2% or under 2%. Same thing with Kansas. I think it's under 1%. In Iowa, under 1%. So it seems to me it's not just, this isn't a function of something that's unique to Western lands. It seems to have developed some other way. Is that true? Is that?
Yeah, that's we can kind of go here. The story on this is really kind of fascinating. So you know, obviously we've got the 13 original colonies, and they were a little upset with overreach from a king, and they decided they wanted to have something a little more resembling independence, and they got together and said, we've got to change this situation. And even at the time of declaring independence, there were some of the colonies that in their colonial charters had claims to the Western Sea, and some interpreted that to the Mississippi River, and some interpreted that all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And other colonies only had their landlocked claims to land. And as they were declaring independence, Maryland stepped up and said, hey, if we do this, if we all get together, and if by some chance we actually win this revolution, there are going to be some colonies, states that have these massive amounts of land, and we'll be landlocked, and we'll trade one imbalance for another. And they said, we've got to figure out this Western land situation. And at the time of the declaration, they said, well, we'll deal with that. We can't deal with everything right now. We'll deal with that later. And Emmett, actually, as they got to the Articles of Confederation, you know, for France to join into the war, they said, we need to know who we're working with. You have to have some kind of confederation. And they're working on the Articles of Confederation, and Maryland brings this issue back up. It says, hey, remember that Western land issue? We're not going to join the Articles of Confederation until you resolve this Western land question. And in September and October of 1780, there was a resolution that said, be it resolved that the land ceded to the United States by the states shall be disposed of to form distinct and independent states with the same rights of sovereignty, freedom, independence as all the other states. And on that basis, Maryland ceded their claims in, and they had the Land Ordinance of 1784 and 85 and the Northwest Ordinance that all talked about this idea that these lands, as they moved west, would be used to settle into distinct independent states. And most people don't realize that for decades, Illinois was 90% federally controlled, Missouri 90% federally controlled. In fact, Florida, the Florida state legislature used to send resolutions to Congress, and they said, we're the worst off of all the Western states coming from Florida. You're controlling all our land. We can't educate our kids and grow our economy. People are fleeing the state for other opportunities. And there was a senator, Thomas Hart Benton. JFK wrote about him in his Profiles in Courage book, that he was one of the most courageous senators. And he talked about this land issue and said the federal government was like a stepmother. Instead of a natural mother, they're the sole purchaser from foreign nations and from the Indian cessions, and they became a monopolizer of the vacant lands in the West. And like all monopolies, it resulted in a hardship upon those upon whom it acted. And we see the same kind of thing today. We see this monopoly of lands in the West, and you know, as Thomas Hart Benton said, like all monopolies, it results in some hardships out west.
That seems like that quote could be applied to a number of different topics beyond land, but I digress. So then, how was it that Illinois and Florida and Missouri got the lands ceded to the state?
You know, this Thomas Hart Benton was kind of the catalyst. He spent 30 years in Congress just teaching and educating on the issue, and really discussing that this was working a hardship on everyone. When you've got a political imbalance, then that creates inequities. There's a great quote when you mentioned the moral issues. George Sutherland is the only member of the US Supreme Court from Utah in the early 1900s. And he was speaking to the New York Bar Association in 1921. And he said, man has three great rights: life, liberty, property. They're so bound together as to be essentially a single right. Because if you give a man his life, but you take away his liberty, you take away all that makes life worth living. If you give him his liberty, but you take from him the property, which is the fruit and the badge of his liberty, you still leave him a slave. And this idea of property as this essential right, Thomas Hart Benton just kept bringing up this issue and talking about it and what it meant for the nation to have these people on their unique people on unique lands with unique solutions to be able to address these problems. And, you know, ultimately they prevailed in that issue. And as we moved west, we forget more and more of our history, and we've come to a point where we think that there's a one-size-fits-all solution to problems. And, you know, on unique lands, it just really is not working in very many ways for a lot of reasons.
Yeah, well, Tocqueville tried to warn us of that. He noted that it's the local decision making that really draws the person, the individual, outward to get to know other citizens, those whom he wouldn't usually deal with, and get to understand them and empathize with them, and form bonds that really were at the heart of the American spirit. And that's something that we seem to have lost. We seem to have forgotten that lesson. So then as the settlers moved westward, at some point though, the land policy, the federal land policy, really, I guess, ushered us into the situation of where we are today. I think that the expansion westward seemed to have worked. The federal land policy, the Homesteading Act, for example, seemed to have worked for Ohio, for example, and Michigan. It seems to have broken down when it got further west. Can you tell us what happened there?
Yeah, and there's a lot of great things that happen from federal policy. There's a lot of things that the national government can do that the local governments simply aren't equipped to do, and you know, that expansion was something that you know, brought life and the economy and growth throughout the Western United States. But there's a couple different ways to look at it. When Jefferson executed the Louisiana Purchase, you know, if we go back and look at this, I mean, you have all these lands that came through here, and Jefferson acquires 530 million acres. And they recognized that the greatest part of growth and development and care for the land is kind of what you mentioned, communities of interest that are attached to the land. And they disposed of and allowed local control and care and management of those predominantly the 530 million acres throughout the Louisiana Purchase. But as we continue to move west, just like the king originally did with the colonies, and the king wanted to control the 13 colonies, and then, you know, later into the 1820s, as they moved west, the eastern states were controlling these western states and controlled 90% of their lands. As we continue to move west, there's that same attitude of, you know, those people in the west may not be able to care for their own lands and take care of them. We need to take care of those lands for them. And you know, that kind of paternalism is something that repeats itself throughout history. And, you know, we continue to see that. And, you know, today we have policies where this is a report that was done by the Property and Environmental Research Center that looked at the land issue extensively. And they said, by all accounts, our federal lands are in trouble, both in fiscal performance and environmental stewardship. And so, you know, when you look at trying to deal with unique lands in a one-size-fits-all policy, nature doesn't lend itself to that as well. And we're seeing some really traumatic things. But in their report, they studied and said, you know, states manage millions of acres of public land, both in the East and in the West. And, you know, they said on average, the states generate nearly $15 for every dollar they spend managing state public lands. The federal government loses $1.27 for every dollar they spend managing public land. And so you see different things, and you know, the environmental outcomes are very similar. And so, you know, when you look at a situation like that, you've got political issues, you've got environmental issues, you've got economic issues, you have self-governance and national governance issues that all center around this kind of anomaly that has developed historically.
So we're talking about the the federally controlled public lands. And as I understand it, there's 5 major agencies that hold these lands, that hold about 95, 96% of those lands, right? Those are the Bureau of Land Management, the Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife, National Park Service, and Department of Defense. In my mind, I've kind of broken them down into a couple different categories. There's Department of Defense. I think that's kind of self-explanatory. And Fish and Wildlife Service and National Park Service seem to be geared toward preserving resources, historical sites and battlefields, and places of great beauty like Yellowstone. Fish and Wildlife Service seems to really be concerned with what preserving the wildlife and running wildlife sanctuaries. And then you get 2 other agencies, the Bureau of Land Management and the Forest Service. And these seem to really have as a big part of their mission the generation of economic activity. So they seem to be kind of different from the other 3. Is that correct, or can you comment on that?
Yeah, I'm glad you pointed that out. And so there are very different types of public land. And so most people, when they think of federal lands, they think of the national parks, right? That's what comes to mind. And we've got a lot of national parks and we love them. They're spectacular. Arches and Zion and Bryce Canyon. And these are spectacular places. We invite the world, and we'll always invite the world to come and see these.
Right, to behold. Yeah. I was there a couple of years ago with my family. Absolutely gorgeous.
Oh, they're just magnificent. I mean, they really are magnificent treasures. But when we talk about land management, that's not what we're talking about, right? Those deserve heightened protection, and I don't think there's anyone that disagrees with that. But then there's a lot of just garden variety land. In fact, I'll get to some pictures here in just a second. Emmett, we discovered in Utah, there's more than 150,000 acres of BLM and Forest Service land right in the middle of city boundaries. These are right within city limits, that we've got hundreds of thousands of acres of Forest Service and BLM land. These are just garden variety lands sometimes in the middle of neighborhoods, sometimes, some within city limits. And then within a mile, there's another 650,000 acres or so within a mile. So the size of Rhode Island, we have of federal land within a mile of city boundaries. Just locked up, that's sitting fallow, that's not productive. And meanwhile, we've got housing affordability issues, we've got overcrowding issues, we've got all the kinds of homesteading issues and things that are going on that these speak to some pretty tremendous opportunities that are available. And yeah, we can talk about that a little bit more. I mean, some of these have already been modeled in places like Las Vegas through Harry Reid and others, but yeah, it's very critical to understand that when we talk in general, the vast majority of public lands, we're not talking about national parks and congressionally designated wilderness areas. We're talking about garden variety land that were always intended to be for what they call multiple use and sustained yield.
I sort of pulled the numbers and did the calculations for Utah as an example. And so by my calculations, 68% of, the feds own about 63% of Utah, and the Bureau of Land Management owns directly about 42%. Right. And then next is Forest Service. It seems to own about maybe half as much as what BLM owns, and then much smaller percentages, I think under 1% for Fish and Wildlife Service, and only 6.3% for the National Park Service, and under 1% for Department of Defense. So that really I think really shows that we're not talking about public parks here, and we're not talking about fish and wildlife. It's really land that's meant to be under productive use, and for the most part, the federal government's trying to put it under productive use. Is that correct?
Well, there was an era where that was the predominant intention. You know, constitutionally, there were certain limited areas that the federal government could own land within a state, and that was spelled out in the Constitution. They had a great debate about that. In fact, during the constitutional debate, in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17, they talked about where could the national government exercise exclusive legislation? Where would it be the power of government? And they said, well, clearly the seat of government. We're going to cede 10 square miles for the national government to have that power, because they'd had issues with in Philadelphia and unable to protect the seat of Congress. They said, we have to have a seat of Congress that's independent. And then they said, other areas that are purchased by the national government with the consent of the state legislature for specific things: forts, arsenals, dockyards, batteries, other needful buildings. And so they were really careful about that. And in the debate, they said if that weren't the case, if the national government could use the public treasury and acquire land throughout states and hold it and exercise power over it, Elbridge Gerry said they would exercise undue awe within a state by acquiring land. And so that was a very key component that we need to have that governing equality that you talked about, those communities of interest and the ability to determine the destiny of your own community. They were very careful about that and said, okay, to secure that right, to protect that, national government can purchase land for specific purposes, but with the consent of the national, or with the consent of the state legislature. And we've evolved to a point now where that's just been totally ignored, with national monument acts simply being done by the stroke of a presidential pen and locking up millions of acres of land that I mean, to give you an example, in Utah, I was on the Public Utilities Technology Committee. I chaired that for a while. I was on the Natural Resources Committee. We can't run emergency communication networks. We can't run power lines or roads or fiber optics for schools and networks without going through a bureaucratic challenge and oftentimes complete inability to get federal permissions to even run emergency communication systems. Because as you can see in Utah, to get anywhere in the state, you've got to go through federal land. And so to not even be able to govern your state on basic police power issues of health, safety, and welfare because of the interplay of that kind of land. That's what Elbridge Gerry and others were talking about, this idea of undue awe, if they didn't have some guardrails on what the federal government could control and retain and exercise authority over.
Well, you spoke of the PILT Act, which was passed in 1976, I believe. And is that a possible solution, or does that need to be modified? Does that provide relief at all?
Yeah, so that's a place where we are now, that that we've had these debates on all sides of the issue. We've looked at a number of aspects of the public land issues. And now we're at a place where you saw from the legislation, unanimous bipartisan buy-in that says, look, as long as the federal government controls the land, retains the land, and just take that off the table, to the extent that the federal government retains the land, just pay the fair taxable value, as was promised. And in fact, let me go forward here. I'll show you some of just kind of back up and let's come back to that. So when we look at federally owned land and you look at wildfires greater than 250 acres, there's a stewardship issue. It used to be that federal management policy was to manage the federal forest like a garden, to harvest and tend and clear and cultivate. And since the 1980s, it hasn't been that way. And as the overgrowth in the forests have grown up, we see these massive fires that are burning on the order of 8 to 10 million acres a year and just destroying communities. And then after the fire come floods, and and just wipe out the communities for years. I can show you pictures like this, I mean, by the dozens, where you see just on one side of a fence line to another, that federally owned property on the left and private property or state property or tribal property on the right. In fact, after the wildfire in Arizona, there was an article in the Energy Environment News that said what the federal government could have learned if it knew tribal lore. The fire started in the Apache Sitgraves National Forest, and it started on the fence line from the Apache Reservation Forest and the National Forest, and it burned 500,000 acres in the National Forest and barely did any damage in the Apache Forest at all, because they had been thinning the forest, they've been harvesting, they've been actively managing the forest, and the fire dropped to the ground and went out and did very little damage. And in the National Forest, it devastated protected species, it decimated wildlife. I mean, they estimate that on average 10 to 20 animals per acre are burned alive, and then their habitat is destroyed for decades. And and then you've got the mineral component in national lands that they estimate $150 trillion in mineral value, and in this there's a lot of the strategic minerals, the rare earth elements and those sorts of things that are necessary for military technology, electronics technology. All of the renewable energy technology requires rare earth elements. These are locked up all over in federal lands, and so from that stewardship aspect, there's a really big issue there. But coming back to your question on the PILT Act, there was a tremendous study that was done, almost a decade-long study, the Public Land Law Review Commission, and they produced findings, and from those findings came the Federal Land Policy Management Act and the Payment in Lieu of Taxes Act. And they said in their findings that we have to have a new policy enacted to make public lands available for the expansion of existing cities and towns. We understand that we're going to have more than 100 million people by the year 2000, and the public lands are going to play a role in this expansion of communities. And we're going to need to accommodate 10 cities of 100,000 people, or 100 cities of 100,000 people and 10 cities of 1 million from the public land. And we believe that such a measure is going to facilitate planning and orderly urban growth and make public lands needed for development, get them on the tax rolls more quickly, and reduce the administrative expense to the federal government. That was going to play a role in this continued expansion. That was part of the FLIPMA Act. It was part of the PILT Act. The interests of all concerned are going to be promoted by a continuing program of periodic valuation of the land. And for administrative simplicity and uniformity, we have to have a payment in lieu of tax system that requires a systematic approach to the valuation of the land expressly for tax purposes. And instead, Emmett, they took a valuation approach where they simply look at population and the number of acres, and they put a formula that doesn't take into account the location, the value of lands at all. And Western communities are supposed to govern and do search and rescue and do all of the necessary things with a system that is wholly inadequate to cover the governing expenses. I mean, the lifeblood of government is its ability to raise revenue.
Yeah. And what do you, is there consensus on this? Is there progress toward getting a proper evaluation?
Yeah, so this is what Utah's working on now, and unanimous bipartisan support. So recently the Senate Minority Leader and the House Minority Leader were with the majority chairs of the Federalism Commission at CSG, discussing this approach to conduct valuations and get the federal government to just honor that promise and say, look, as long as you're retaining the lands, just pay this promise to pay the fair taxable value. And this was something in this report that they said, look, the representatives of the state and local government should agree on this valuation. And this is kind of an interesting one, Emmett. They said, the commission believes that it's that the total cost of valuing federal lands is irrelevant if the national interest requires protecting the lands to keep them retained in federal ownership, then it's a proper cost to be borne by all the federal taxpayers. And that's just an argument and something that needs to come forward now. And you're seeing Republicans and Democrats coming forward on that.
Mhm. You mentioned a little while ago that in Nevada, Harry Reid had helped work out some solutions. Can you address that? Or
Yeah, that's it's actually a really interesting situation. So this goes back to how the PILT is calculated from the Congressional Research Service. I mean, imagine you're a county and you can never tell from one year to the next how much revenue you're going to have from 80, 90% of your land. There's some counties that have 3% taxable land, 3% taxable land, and they can never tell from one year to the next. And it's calculated based on your population, not on the value of your land, not what the land could produce, but it's based on your population. And if you can't provide government services and you lose population, then you have this negative spiral where you get less and less PILT, and it becomes a negative spiral down. And so you've got a chart that takes population, and you get the lesser of, the greater of, and only if Congress funds it, and basically held hostage. Let me come down here to the what we were talking about with Harry Reid. It's called the Southern Nevada Public Land Management Act. Well, this will give you an example. This is federal land right in the middle of a community. So you've got federal land that is in between a golf course and a housing project, and they pay $55 a year in the property tax replacement for land that's right between a golf course and a housing project. And there are lands like that throughout communities. Of course, there's other land outside of cities, but again, not national parks, not wilderness areas. These are garden variety lands. So Harry Reid was able to work something out in the Southern Nevada Public Lands Management Act that between the 90s and in 1998, he passed the bill. They were able to dispose of more than 35,000 acres, and it generated positive net revenue to the federal Treasury. These are lands in and around Las Vegas in Clark County. And they went from 106,000 acres of land in and around Las Vegas to 30,000 acres. And so they were able to take that land, use that for recreation and public purposes, for growth and low-income housing and a variety of other things. Again, land in and around the community to be able to use that for positive growth. And that's where we kind of look at, there are opportunities in this story that really could get to a win-win opportunity, where folks in the East aren't paying taxes to subsidize lands, and it's not being held as a political leverage point over communities in the West. There's ways to get lands that can be productive they're in the middle of communities, and that's what folks in the West are starting to work on and trying to teach our friends in the East that there are opportunities in this, that we don't need to be burning 10 million acres of forest a year and destroying habitat and watershed. And there's ways to make these communities more resilient and self-reliant, and have a policy that reflects the uniqueness of the people in the communities and the uniqueness of the land.
You mentioned the mineral reserves. So we have a question from one of the viewers, as to the value of those mineral reserves. Can you give us any sort of orders of magnitude as to what types of minerals there are and how much it would be worth, maybe to the state or the federal treasury or?
Yeah, that's kind of an interesting thing as well. I mean, if you look at Texas and New Mexico, that same Permian Basin is on both sides of the state boundary. Exact same oil formation. The formation in New Mexico that falls within federal land, it's much harder to permit, to move things forward. The revenue ends up going to the federal coffers, and on the Texas side, it's created an economic boom and industry, and so you have the exact same mineral resource that has very, very different outcomes based on the governing control over the resource. So states in the West have a hard time with, they were formed as states because of their population, their resource, the water, the variety of things. When they made a state, they made the boundaries based on what did they think it would take for that state to have a roughly equal chance at prosperity with other states. And so some of the reason the states were much larger in the West was they are arid, they have different resources and abilities. And Congress looked at all those different factors and said, okay, these states, to have roughly proportionate representation in Congress, to have roughly a proportionate opportunity of having a similar population, that state's going to need to be a different size and take in a different shape. And they looked at all of that. And so when the land holdings are limited, when you've got one landowner that occupies 60% of your land, imagine in any of your states, you had one landowner that owns 60% of the land. It wouldn't matter who it is, that would be a cause for concern in a state because of the influence that would be there. But our populations are artificially held down over the rationale for forming the state. And so when you look at the representation in Congress, we have 90% of our people live on 1% of the land in Utah. We're artificially reduced in population to even have an equal chance of having a similar voice in Congress. As far as the mineral breakdown, I would direct them to the Institute for Energy Research, is where that report came from a few years ago. And Institute for Energy Research, they would have all the breakdown on, it was 150 trillion in mineral value back then. And then they would have the breakdown on what specifically is the various breakdown. But what we do know is certainly the strategic minerals, the rare earth elements that are such a major play now, that China has over the years taken such a big play to occupy and dominate that market. It really is a strategic stranglehold on defense technology, renewable energy technology, and those sorts of things.
What minerals are those?
Oh, they're called rare earth.
Mm-hmm. Rare
earth elements, molybdenum, and all sorts of other different things that are heavily used in electronic technology and renewable energy technology, defense technology.
And right now, so we're importing those from China and elsewhere, or is that?
Yeah, China a few decades ago really targeted that as a specific strategic kind of a choke point. That in order to advance in certainly defense technology and electronic technology, that was the gateway for all of these other technologies. And so they made some very specific plays to lock down the supply. And the fact that we're shutting down our own internal supply of those gives China a very strategic position.
And then you had mentioned earlier too that there's important minerals that are critical to the renewable energy industry that aren't being utilized. Is that correct?
Yeah, those are a lot of the same sorts of things. I mean, graphite, graphene. Yeah, there's a number. If you were to search rare earth elements, there's all kinds of articles on that. 60 Minutes did a story on this a few years ago that talked about how strategic it is and kind of the tenuous position that we're in as a nation. President Trump had done some executive orders based on trying to encourage and promote the development and supply, the investigation and making available internal reserves. But yeah, it's an area that's going to continue to be a big source of concern and study, because all of this electronic technology, as we continue to advance, relies on a very specific set of these minerals to be able to produce them. And if we're beholden on that supply, then that chokes us off in the ability to deploy a number of those technological advancements.
All right, Ken, we have a question on whether you could give some example of specific issues where it's better to have federal government in charge and specific issues where it's better for the state to be the primary decision maker? Or is it a matter of the two of them coordinating, I suppose? Can you give us some examples along those lines to illustrate that division?
Yeah, it's a great question. There are certainly areas of both, and the Constitution was very careful at trying to draw that balance. The very nature of our system was dividing power and carefully balancing power so that we have this coordinated government. Our federal government was a system of a national government and states coordinating and sharing power to deal with those things. Certainly military. I mean, that was one of the primary drivers of the more perfect union. How can we be many and diverse for life, liberty, and property, for the things that are of our daily life and concern, and then how can we be one for international trade, for military and diplomacy and those sorts of things. So clearly military, I think the highways have evolved from the post road system that was set out in the Constitution, and to develop that, the lubricant, if you will, of interstate commerce. I think those are great examples. I think at the state level, I was really impressed one time, Emmett. I was coming back from Idaho from speaking on some of these subjects, and I'm driving back, and in Idaho it was potato field and a potato field and another potato field, and as soon as I hit the Utah border, it was like the potato field stopped. It was a very similar area geography, but Idaho is really, there's a lot of potatoes in Idaho, and in Utah there's not nearly as many potatoes. Well, they have a different economy and a different focus and a different direction in what they're doing because of their geography, and those unique lands require very unique solutions, and one size does not fit all. And I'll tell you, it breaks my heart in the forest issues. We had 2 years ago a fire broke out in August near Provo. Provo is one of the second most populated areas in Utah. It's right south of Salt Lake. And a fire broke out, and our state forester gets to the federal forestry people and says, put that fire out. These are the hottest, driest conditions, put that out. And the federal official said, no, we're going to let it burn because we don't have a lot of tools in our arsenal to reduce the understory, the overgrowth. And so when a lightning strike hits, they're allowed by federal regulations to let the fire continue to burn. They can't start preventative fires and do prescriptive burns, but if a lightning strike happens, they can watch and manage. And so they take this fire that's near a populated area because they don't have a lot of tools to manage the overgrowth. They let it burn, it gets out of control. Of course, it burns, displaces people, and now you've got the flood and all of the other things that come from that. Because a federal policy that is a one-size-fits-all policy for administrative simplicity doesn't deal with the unique life, liberty, and property issues on the ground. And so, those are really critical issues. The wild horse and burrow issue is another one where we're having a one-size-fits-all management approach from Washington that just does not reflect local communities, and it really is harming the environment in very serious ways.
So we have another question. Does the federal government ever choose to divest itself of land it owns, especially the garden variety sort of land you talked about that exists even in cities? Why might the federal government do this, or why might it not? Do private citizens ever make the case to the federal government that they or their cities might make use of this land better? So I guess that's a question to you to evaluate what the federal government does and sort of what the grassroots efforts are like.
Yeah, there are disposals all the time. They don't happen as much as they used to. It used to be a very cooperative atmosphere. Up until 1976, there were regular disposals. Now you see acquisitions as well as disposals. There was the Land and Water Conservation Fund that was that had a permanent authorization last year to acquire additional federal lands. But yeah, you still see disposals frequently. For these communities, I mean, that's something clearly when you've got 150,000 acres in the middle of city limits, you know, those are the kinds of things that there should be an expedited process to really allow for the lands in and around cities to be dealt with from those local communities more frequently. And that process just takes literally an act of Congress.
Yeah. Well, following on that, next question is, it's really big that there's any issue with bipartisan support in today's climate. What shared principles between liberals and conservatives, in your opinion, does this bipartisan agreement reveal?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, you know, the idea of educating children, right? Government only has so many pools of resource to be able to fund education. And in Utah and in Western states, for example, when they have such a low percentage of taxable land, and again, you got property tax, income tax, and sales tax to be able to fund government. I mean, that's something we can all agree on. We've got to have the tools at our disposal. The tax revenue, the taxes should be fair, and they should be only as necessary to run government. But as we're educating children, we've got to have the same opportunity as our friends in the East to be able to educate from the increasing value of property instead of relying on federal handouts to be able to run communities. So I think that and then just the fairness aspect. This was a promise that was already made. In 1976, when they said, we're not going to dispose of land anymore, we know that's going to be a hardship, you're not going to be able to generate tax revenues, we commit to you that we're going to pay the tax equivalent value. And that's just simply never happened.
So we have, why is the federal government so much worse than the state at forest management? Does the sheer size of federally managed lands play an important factor? Or is it because it is not local, as you have been mentioning?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We had Commissioner Claudia Jarrett in an interview one time, and we asked her about her experience with the forest supervisors and the rangers. And she said, look, I've been a county commissioner for 12 years. And in my 12 years, I can't remember the exact number, but it was like 5 supervisors and 4 different rangers. And she said, they all come from the East. Our forests are different. They're unique. It's different than a forest in Arkansas or New Jersey. And so they spend the first 2 years learning the conditions, and then they're transferred out. So just this turnover, and she says, well, you know, we'll just get them trained to understand our conditions and our forests, and then they're rotated out somewhere. So there's certainly that aspect to it. But anytime you're trying to apply for administrative simplicity, a one-size-fits-all policy, because from an administrative standpoint, if you can have one policy, well, that's simple. But trees are different, the forests are different, the humidity and the climate conditions are different. And so to not take into account that, you know, those local conditions, particularly when the lives and livelihoods depend upon it. Emmett, when they had the Bryan Head fire, a huge fire, and it burned right through one of the top 10 blue ribbon fisheries in the nation. And I went down, I was there just a couple of days after the fire hit. And Jerry Owen had purchased an 8,000 gallon water tanker with his own money. It showed up 3 days after the fire hit. He'd ordered it a month early because everybody knew the fire was coming. And everybody down there said, why won't they let us? We all knew this was coming. Why wouldn't they let us take preventative measures? We all knew that our land and our livelihoods were a powder cake ready to explode. It's like living next to a dynamite factory. Why wouldn't they let us do something about it? We all knew it was coming. And those conditions are happening all over the West.
So well, following that, then you've been talking a lot about the difference between Eastern versus Western Americans, and how Eastern Americans unfortunately don't know how this issue of federal Western land policy affects them as taxpayers. Do you think lawmakers from the West are plagued less by partisan division than their Eastern or urban counterparts?
Oh, I think there's plenty of partisan divide to go around. You know, sadly, Emmett, I really think that that we are endangering our communities by being more focused on left-right versus local-national. Government seems to centralize under either party. And it's that centralization that takes away what you mentioned with de Tocqueville, where we learn self-governance, we're attached to our communities, we engage, and we're seeing so many people check out because they can't affect policy at a national level. And so then they wonder, why should I even bother? Why should I even engage? And our system of government was developed so that your voice was amplified at the local level, so that your voice did matter at the local level. Your state representative was your neighbor, and he was directly accountable to you. And you had that ability to affect the things that concerned your life, liberty, and property, Madison tells us in Federalist 45, at that level. But the more things are centralized, you have less and less of a voice. There's 529 members of Congress aren't from Utah. They care less about Utah, and yet they're controlling the management of the forest in Utah and whether or not a community is going to be burned out and then washed out and lose their livelihood. And yeah, there's something very tragically wrong with a system that was designed to reflect the diversity, the uniqueness of our land, of our culture, of our systems, of our people, that has been all centralized into one, where we're losing the good parts of that diversity and of that self-governance and of perpetuating our system. I think that's a real tragic situation that's happening right now, where systemically we're not honoring this beautiful system that was meant to promote diversity, self-governance, the uniqueness of lands and communities.
Yeah, and really promoting the diversity of people when there's those local conversations going on about, well, what do we do on this issue? What do we do on that issue? The people involved in those conversations are sort of lifted up, and I think they're looked at in esteem by their neighbors, just by the very virtue that they're involved in the issue, that they're discussing the issue. And I think it's a very uplifting experience. And as Tocqueville said, you learn to appreciate other people, and you can look at it theologically in dealing with another person, in dealing with their desires and their fears and their needs. You're really getting to know that person as being made in the image and likeness of God, of the Creator. But when those discussions are removed, we have less of a need to really reach out to other people and to encounter them and to discuss these issues with them. We get to know them less, and it ends up being really, I think, adding to the rancor in society. And I think it also adds to the alienation that people feel with their government. Well, why isn't the government handling this issue or that issue? Why don't they listen to me?
Yeah, I think you reminded me of a quote. I'm going to try to pull this up here quickly. I think it's one of the greatest examples of why our system was designed the way it was. Here it is right here. So it says, God left the world unfinished for man to work his skill upon. He left the electricity in the cloud, the oil in the earth. He left the rivers unbridged and the forests unfelled and the cities unbuilt. God gives to man the challenge of raw materials, not the ease of finished things. He leaves the pictures unpainted and the music unsung and the problems unsolved, that man might know the joys and the glories of creation. It was Thomas S. Monson, a religious leader in Utah who passed a few years ago, but that man might know the joys and glories of creation. And so they looked at how do we create a system that protects that right? And clearly a monarchy wouldn't do it. Not a democracy, a pure democracy, that wouldn't do it. And not just a typical republic. And so Madison says in Federalist 51, in a single republic, you have checks and balances through the different departments, executive, legislative, judicial. But in the compound Republic of America, power is first divided among two distinct governments as a double security, and they control each other. And you know, that system that both amplifies the voice also provides that double security. And you know, it was Hamilton that said that we need to pay particular attention to that balance between the state and national government, because it is a double security. And you know, we're seeing that people are losing their voice more and more, and I think nothing is more emblematic of that than land, because it's so essential to the how we do, you know, create. That we know the joys and glories of creation. That's the essence of self-governance. And so, yeah, I think this is a bigger conversation that maybe we can have sometime. That whole very structure of our government and what's happening to that, and how we get states to begin to connect with their role in maintaining that balance that's critical to our ability to exercise our voice.
Yeah, and you're exercising dominion over the earth, and that really has to be done in association with other people, and that's how the framers intended it. So not centralized government. You know, it was you talk about centralized government and the people, it brings to mind another passage from Tocqueville. So, you know, really a tyrant doesn't care whether you love him or not. He just wants to or whether you hate him, he just wants to make sure you don't love each other.
Yeah.
But I really think that gets to the point that it's through the interaction with other people, it's through making these decisions and deciding on these issues of creation, that we really get to a cohesive society. And that's why it's best if these decisions are made locally where they can be.
Right.
We have another question on, does a concentration of federal lands affect individual property tax rates? Are they higher in Utah than comparable areas in other states with less land owned by the federal government?
Yeah, that's a really good question. If you think about it, if you have a large landowner that is perhaps not making highest and best use of the land, what does that do to the value of lands around it and the usability of lands around it? So, you know, one of the things I mentioned earlier, we have a difficult time doing roads. We have a difficult time doing communication systems because there's a patchwork, literally a patchwork of federal lands. And so the way it was laid out, Jefferson laid out a grid in a township, and there were 36 squares of land in a township. And so when states, as they moved west, they would give one section to a state for education purposes, and then some states they'd give 2 sections, and in Utah they gave 4 sections, and just randomly. And so you've got these townships laid out in a grid, and you've got 2, 16, 32, and 36 that were given to the state of Utah. And then you had other federal lands, and it was always envisioned that the lands would be disposed. The education system would have those lands as a trust, like a trust fund, and then they'd be able to work with the land. Well, historically, as it moved forward, those lands just got frozen in time. And so you've got these sections that are complete islands. And so you'll have a federal section in the middle of a city or in the middle of a county, and you'd have a school section in the middle of a city or a county. And if those lands aren't naturally being deployed and aren't naturally being used, the lands all around it become unusable. There's a situation, a farmer down in Phoenix, Arizona. He's got a farm, a 640-acre farm, perhaps more than that. There's a 40-acre parcel right in the middle of it that's BLM land. And for years and years, they would continue to farm the land, and the BLM finally came in and said, no, you can't touch that land. You can't touch that land. And so he's farming all around it, and he's got a weed patch right in the middle of his farm. You can imagine what that does to his work and what that does to the value. And so you have those same kind of situations happening throughout the states. You just got these lands that are not being cultivated, cared, managed to the same extent as neighboring lands. And yeah, it drastically affects the value.
Here in the East, we call those vacant lots.
Yeah.
Well, it just, I guess if one last question, and to wrap it up, Ken, just a question on something you touched on earlier. which was the Native American lands. Are these part of the federal lands we've been talking about? Are these part of the lands that are managed by these 5 agencies, or is that something completely different?
Yeah, that's typically something completely different. So there's also the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and then you've got tribal lands that are, part of the sovereign nations of lands. And so, yeah, that's generally a very different situation. I mean, they're not taxable as well, but yeah, that's a different situation that has its own unique law and intricacies surrounding it.
Well, Ken, thank you very much. Thank you on behalf of the Institute for Human Ecology and the Catholic University of America. It's a fascinating topic, and hopefully it'll generate a lot of positive discourse, and really maybe be part of a effort to bring the country together, in a sort of a bipartisan effort toward a more cohesive, productive society. But thanks a lot for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, we're thrilled to be in a place that we've got bipartisan agreement taking this first steps. That's a big deal on a public land issue. And I like the statement that Ronald Reagan made in 1987. He said, "This is a wonderful time to be alive. We're lucky not to live in pale and timid times." And we could certainly say that today. He says, "We've been blessed with the opportunity to stand for something, for liberty and freedom and fairness. And here we're talking property and self-governance." And he said, "These are things worth fighting for, worth devoting our lives to. So let us go forth with good cheer and stout hearts, happy warriors, out to seize back a country and a world of freedom." We've got great opportunity ahead. Emmett, thank you so much for the opportunity. And as we continue the dialogue, there is tremendous opportunity with what we have in our nation to govern ourselves and deal with the problems ahead. And we've got great people to do that. So
that's a great note to close on, Ken. It is a wonderful time to be alive, and there's lots of opportunities ahead. Thank you very much, and safe travels, and congratulations on the new grandbaby.
Yeah, thank you. You might have heard a little crying in the background in the Zoom age, but we're absolutely thrilled to have this new grandson healthy and happy, and I really appreciate him. It's such an honor to be with you. You're such a good man, and you do such great work, and it really is a privilege and an honor to spend some time with you here.
Thank you, Ken. Have a good afternoon.